Ürün yönetimi eğitimlerimize Üretim Bandı adıyla başladık ve şimdi Brick Institute markası altında devam ediyor. Brick Institute'da sektörün lider şirketlerinden katılımcılar ve deneyimli eğitmenlerle birlikte uygulamalı, dünya standartlarında eğitimler sunuyoruz. Bugüne kadar yüzlerce arkadaşımız bu eğitimlere katıldı. Amacımız gerçek vaka çalışmalarından oluşan, sadece teoride kalmayan, elleri kirleterek öğreten eğitimler düzenleyerek sektöre dünya standartında ürün geliştirenler yetiştirmek. Haydi birbirimizden öğrenelim ve topluma fayda sağlayacak teknolojik ürünler geliştirelim. Kayıt aldığımız eğitim programlarımızı görmek için www.brick.institute linkini ziyaret edebilir ya da selam@brick.institute adresinden bizimle iletişime geçebilirsin. Selam Üretim Bandı dinleyicisi. Üretim Bandı aslında bir podcast'ten daha fazlası. Biz aktif bir topluluğuz. Ürün geliştirme ve şirket yönetimi ile alakalı konularda kendi aramızda konuştuğumuz ve yeni şeyler öğrendiğimiz aktif bir Slack platformumuz var. Katılmak istersen üretimbandı.com/slack linkine giderek topluluğumuza giriş yapabilir, sadece topluluğa özel oluşturduğumuz içerik ve etkinliklerden faydalanabilirsin. Unutmadan, topluluk üyeleriyle paylaştığımız, 2 haftada bir yayınladığımız bültenimize de bekleriz. üretimbandı.com/bülten linkinden bültene kaydolabilirsin. Keyifli öğrenmeler. Welcome everyone to Üretim Bandı. We have a special guest today, Amir Salihefendic. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
You are.
Okay, perfectly. I should have checked beforehand, but so this is an interesting story because we're having this conversation in Istanbul, near Galata Tower, in a studio. And this happened because a couple of days ago, and I saw your tweet that you were in Istanbul and you were attending an Android meetup. And I was brave enough to ask you if you were open to a podcast recording, and you said yes. And I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much for accepting it.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's we're having a blast in Istanbul. It's a beautiful city, and yeah, we have a lot of great experiences. Also, lots and lots of food. Yeah,
Delicious food. I bet.
Delicious food. Yeah, very delicious. Too delicious. It's hard to stop eating.
Never too delicious. Yeah. So you're here with some of your team doing a retreat, I guess.
Yeah, we do these mini retreats for teams, just to kind of bond and work together, because usually we are just remote first, spread around the world. And then we meet in different spots around the world during a year. And Istanbul was one of the options, and people could vote. And a lot of people voted on Istanbul. So yeah, here we are.
Good to hear from a Istanbulian, or I don't know what do you call it, but if a Turkish person, it's good to hear that Istanbul was wanted. So you are the founder of Doist. I've used it before, actually, but I've been following you on Twitter for a long time, and it's an impressive story in the sense that it's a story of dedication. It's a story of consistency, putting time and commitment into one single product for, I guess now, more than 16 years.
Yeah.
Okay, because you started in 2007.
Yeah.
The first few years where you were doing something else at the time, it was a side thing?
It was actually my main thing.
Okay.
I did a social network.
Yes.
And then I did Todoist on the side as a side project.
Okay. To just give a sense of how big this company is now, any numbers you can share in terms of number of employees, number of users, so that when people listen to this, they understand the scale?
Yeah, we are about 100 people spread around the world. So we have been remote first for over a decade. Our revenues are about $20 million per year. It's all fully bootstrapped, no VC funding. Yeah, and in terms of users, we have millions of users. So it really depends, you want the vanity metric or the real metric.
No, the real metric.
So the real metric is we have millions of active users, but we have tens of millions of signups.
Sure.
So yeah. And a lot of times, people just present their signups,
which is an accumulation of email lists.
Exactly. So I think the really interesting part is kind of building, active users. Yeah.
Yeah, and because to-do apps are usually the thing that they use to explain, okay, it's a very basic app that people do. The first project that they do a to-do app. But this one stuck for a long time, and it's a massive app with millions of active users. So it's an interesting story on its own. But one thing so when I was preparing for this interview, one thing that came up and one of the questions that I wanted to focus on was, because you're not VC funded, because there are no investors, because you're the creator of the application, creator of the product, and you're still running it, and you've been doing this for 16 years. I'm guessing that there's a very heavy focus on quality because you're thinking long term. You're not thinking about exiting the company. You're not thinking about selling the company for a financial reason. I don't want to say like what you're thinking because I'm curious what you're going to say, but there is a long-term view in this business, as I can see from afar. So how do you look at the concept of product quality?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, just to circle back, like the whole thing is kind of not having an exit strategy. I use like to joke, or I joke with like, debt as like exit strategy, So, that's kind of the commitment that I'm making to this. And the reason why I think like it's kind of like very contrarian way of building things. And then like you need to kind of make decisions that are long term and everything matters, because you're not going to exit this in a few years. So for instance, like technical debt in the product, or just debt, any kind of design debt, that is, you're going to repay that at some point. And then that becomes, something you need to focus on. Same thing is kind of like sustainability, like having sustainable growth is really critical for this kind of business, because, else at some point, like somebody needs to pay the bill. And a lot of times you're just offsetting that, like investors are paying this initially, and maybe it's going to make money at some point or maybe not. And same thing is like in terms of like product quality, if you're building for the long term, then like product quality is really, really critical. Yeah. And I think also something as well that's, at like the core like ethos of Doist and what we do is kind of like improving ourselves, improving our products, and doing this, just like setting the bar higher and higher, and then like improving, everything that we do. So for instance, like if you look at Doist, like 7 years ago, it was very, very different from what it is today. And I hope, in 5 years, it will be very different and better than what we do right now. So kind of like this kind of milestones, initially it was just me like hacking around, and the quality wasn't really that good. Then we brought some people, it kind of improved a bit, and then like we're just pushing this forward. And also as we go along, like trying to find better ways to work, because also like the mission is really like finding a better way to work. And like we are kind of like we want to kind of be, an example of that. So like if we want to build like a better way to work, then like we need to start with ourselves. So in this, like we also question a lot like from first principles, So for instance, like the way that we do like product is very different from what many others do. Or just like, the way that we work together, like we have our own systems, like we don't use OKRs. And honestly, like, sometimes this can also be very problematic because you're maybe like doing something that others have already figured out does not really work. So I think that's kind of like the biggest problem is kind of like, redoing other people's mistakes.
What kind of systems do you use? Like you said OKR, but like what's your system like?
So the system we use is called Do system. So honestly, it's kind of like, we have like worked on this for like over a decade now. And we are also not really afraid of like testing stuff out, seeing if it works, see if it doesn't really work. So basically right now, so the way that we basically do is like we split the year up in 2 halves. But before that, actually, we do have like a long-term strategy, like a 3-year strategy that we're executing. And that is something like we worked on the leadership team, like got everybody's buy-in, like this is the way, that we're going to do that. And then we kind of like try to split this up into like smaller chunks that we're executing on. And these chunks are basically like, every half year, we have like 3 top priorities that we do. We don't have more than that. So for instance, right now, like a top priority is like Todoist teams. So we are adding like multiplayer to Todoist, or like improving the multiplayer aspect of Todoist. That is like a top priority. Then we have fundamentals, and it's basically like improving, the fundamentals features of Todoist. And the third one is like operational excellence. So we're basically trying to like improve our internal systems. And then we basically like allocate all people into these 3 top priorities. So that's like the Do system basically that. It's kind of like a way to prioritize work and also just like align everybody on a few things that really matter. So that's one element of that. And of course, like another big problem like with just like priorities or like having top priorities, like you still need to do maintenance of the systems. You need to fix bugs, you need to take care of like if a customer has an issue, you need to go in and understand what the issue is. So we also have like a maintenance squad that also does like internal work, so like refactoring, improving systems or libraries or whatever.
Is that team only focused on that, or is that like a rotational team?
That's a rotational team. Okay. Because something we have also found out is like if you just allocate people to work on support, like they burn out.
They die inside.
they die because it's super stressful, and it's also like most people don't really like that type of work.
Yeah.
So we basically have like rotation every quarter, where we basically rotate people in and out.
And how big are these teams?
So like maintenance squad, it's actually quite a bit. It's 25 people.
25?
25.
Oof.
Yeah. Because that's also something like if you want to improve product quality, you need to get all of the smaller things. And also over time, you build depth that you need to repay. So that's something we have found out, like this is actually a very critical thing. It's not only like working on the top priorities, you also need to do all of like, the smaller things that maybe don't really matter in the big picture, but in aggregate, it matters a lot.
So this 25 only developers? 25 developers?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many developers are there in the company?
I mean, I think we have like, 60 or something like that. I don't know. We have a lot of developers.
Okay, so 25 out of the 60 is focused on refactoring, bug maintenance, support, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it's maybe less. Like we do have some designers and some support people as well. So maybe it's 20 developers 20. And then 5 like, like some designers. Yeah.
So basically 1/3 of the development force is focused on maintenance and refactoring and all that. That's that's a pretty high number, not in the sense that like it shows the focus that you have on the importance of maintenance. And like you're saying, like it needs to be sustainable. One of the first things you said was we need to work on tech debt, design debt, whatever. And 1/3 of the team is focused on that. So it's very interesting. Like I think that's a very bold, and I like how like it's very directed. Like we're gonna focus on that, whatever that is, and we're gonna spend a decent amount of our resources on that. That's interesting. And has it always been this way, like 1/3, let's say?
No, it has not. So we have basically tried different models for this. And honestly, like I think initially, like we deprioritized this because, a lot of times you think like, okay, working on a new feature or a new initiative, it's much better than actually fixing what you already have.
Yeah, it's more exciting.
It's more exciting. You can market this to users and they get excited.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is really like if you are thinking about long term and you're making these bets for the long term, then you really need to have a strong core. And if you at some point like don't really repay that or like maintain that, then implementing new things becomes much, much harder. So actually by maintaining the strong core, like you have great libraries, you don't have like a lot of like, just like mess inside the code base or even inside the design systems, it becomes much, much easier to actually add new things. So that's something we found out, especially like on our backend and API, we were not very like proactive in repaying debt or like maintaining systems, we were just building on and on and on. And at some point, you reach a stage where implementing a new feature is really, really difficult. Yeah, and then, suddenly like implementing an extension or like, a new feature takes like 3x than what you should do. And then you have a problem. And then like going in and like fixing that is much, much harder than if you had actually, maintained that system over time. And then also people get burned out because you get set into like these huge refactorings that are super stressful, and super hard to execute. So that's why we are kind of like right now, like we don't want to end up in the same situation, like we need to invest in maintenance, and like it also needs to be like a sexy, thing. People need to go in and do the work there. And we also use like a lot of the prioritization and like best practices that we learned in normal product development. For instance, like scoping, like having a proper, like right spec, like defining the problem, solution space, deliverables, what are the success metrics, like that also needs to be done for maintenance work. If you don't do that, then like developers just go and do random stuff, or like they fix random issues, and then you're not really investing, like given like the amount of people you invest, like we're investing into this, like we need to make sure this like properly executed, and it's kind of like on the same level as the other product work that we have.
So I have two questions. One, how do you prioritize that team's work?
So basically, honestly, like this is a very new structure. So right now, like our CTO Gonzalo is actually like leading this initiative, and he's kind of helping prioritize. And then we also have like these squad leaders. So for instance, like if you're rewriting something, maybe it's like 3 engineers and 1 designer, then you have one of them lead that effort, and they're kind of like in charge of executing that, like making sure the spec is correct, and like executing that work. So that's basically how we do, and that's also how we do the other priorities. So for instance, like for the teams squad, I'm kind of like the DRD, or like a DRI, like directly responsible individual for that. But then like underneath me, I have like squad leads that kind of lead different initiatives, and then they have like a team. So that's basically how we structure work. It's kind of like you have one person that's kind of like probably a C-level person that's kind of in charge and accountable for like a single priority. But underneath them, they have like leaders that lead different efforts.
And for the maintenance team, how do you define like progress? One of the main reasons that you work on this, or you allocate a lot of effort, is so that it's easier to build, or it takes less time to build something or to add some functionality to the application. But some things maybe are less easy, less visible. How do you, I don't want to say track, because it's not about tracking, but it's like defining that, okay, it's good that we did this work kind of thing. Is there like a clear explanation on your side, or the description on your side? Or is it just a bit feel and a bit, KPIs or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like one of the problems we had in the past with this is basically there was no success metrics. We were just like executing random like refactorings or like, improvements. And right now we have become much better at this. So some of it is kind of like customer, feedback, or like customer reporting. That is like one source. Another source is like kind of the team itself. So if Android developers feel like, working with this code is like super like complicated, and like, they get slowed down and like frustrated, then it's kind of like maybe worth like thinking about, do we need to invest in improving that? So that's kind of like the two. And then of course, like you have for some other maintenance work, like performance, you have a lot of tracking on that. So maybe you go in and see, like sync, maybe you want to improve that. And then you have metrics. What is the current baseline? And what do you actually want to improve on that? And I think that's very important. But of course, like I think you're right that some of this work is kind of like very hard to because I think with normal like work, like you do a feature, you can test this feature with customers. You can see if they want to pay, if they want to use it. With this, you improve, let's say, like you refactor something inside the Android app. Maybe you're not going to really see the effects on the customers right away. Yeah. And I think that's fine. I think some of this should also be optimized for like the developers that are working on this, and not only like customers only, because, customers will get the benefit eventually of this work because the code base will become better. The Android devs will be able to improve the code base easier and stuff like that. Yeah. So
the 6-month plans that you have, or like you're going to focus on 3 things for 1 half. How well defined are they? Or is it what you said, like, teams?
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing that we are trying to follow, is kind of like, and honestly, we have tried many different systems on this, but we kind of want to have empowered teams. So what we try to define from like the leadership, or, it's kind of like the objective, and then some success metrics. But how they're going to do that, it's really up to them. So basically, that's the standard way of doing great product development, and that's something we try to follow. The problem, like I think if you don't do that, then people will not really be super engaged, because they will basically, you will tell them what they need to do, and people usually don't really like to, like, I think they will much rather, figure out themselves what they want to do and then implement that, test that. So you really like hold them accountable for like the core objective and like the success metric, but not really how they are going to do that. So for instance, just to give you an example, like in the fundamental squad, what we have defined is kind of like core retention. Like we want to improve the retention, and there's some like stats on that where we want to put it. And then also one of the other things we also want to improve is like the pro upgrade rate. We want to have more paying customers. But basically, like what kind of projects they choose to move those metrics, it's really up to them.
So that's it. That's the brief that they have.
Yeah.
Increase pro upgrade.
Yeah.
Retention. Pro upgrade conversion rate. Okay.
And then we also have like, we have a head of product, Dominic, and we also have some like product managers that are kind of also like really in charge of like scoping and figuring out like where are we going to place the bets. So yeah. And that's also something we are iterating on right now, because also something we have found out like during this, actually that's something like I have been here with the product team in Istanbul, and something we figure out is like when you kickstart off work, having too much like white space is actually very problematic, because then people spend way too much time like wandering around, and no work is getting done. And then you have like, super expensive like developers and designers and product people not really doing a lot. So what we actually want to change a bit is kind of like having, especially from the PM side, a lot more like guidance. So when we kick off like a priority, you kind of have a very good idea what you want to do. You don't need to figure that out. And then like the people, they need to kind of commit to that, or like, alter that plan. Maybe it's not a good plan and they want to change it. That's fine, But like having a starting point, instead of like you kick off with a blank slate and then you spend like a month figuring out what you're going to do. And a lot of times also like the PMs really know what the big opportunities are. So we're basically, just like coming to the same place, but like spending, one more month on that.
And how many people are focused on like one topic or one issue?
So in terms of priorities?
In terms of like the problem or the challenge of like increasing conversion rate for pro package, what's the size of the team that works on that?
I think we maybe have like 15 people on each of or maybe 20.
The designers, product managers, developers all combined.
Yeah. And we also have customer support on those as well. They give us kind of insights into what customers, think.
Okay, so they're very cross-functional teams, not even like, product design development, but also like other teams as well. The ops and the support, and everyone is inside the team, the product building team.
Yeah, exactly. And then we also try to like make like smaller squads, because you don't really want to have one squad with 15 people. So we try to kind of make like squads of like 3 or 4 or 5 max people that are kind of handling like a specific thing, like, of that.
Who's the DRI, the directly responsible individual for one squad? What that one 15 people group?
It can actually be anybody. So it can be a product designer, it can be an engineer. It really depends on the problem. It can also be a PM as well. So yeah, that's also something we try to do, is like kind of make leadership, spread around, instead of like it's only concentrated on some, people. Yeah, this said, like I think something that we're also going to iterate on and try is kind of like for execution squads, actually having like engineers as leaders. Yeah, that's kind of the bet that we're trying to do. I'm actually not sure how good this works, but the problem is if you don't, a lot of times, once you have figured out what is the problem, the hard challenge is really the engineering part. And then having like, for instance, like just say product designer lead the effort sometimes feels off, because, that is not really the hardest challenge in a lot of stuff, like especially the execution part,
How do you ensure that there is a, I guess, sustained and consistent level of quality in the execution teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like something we do is like we try to follow like similar processes. So the do system kind of specifies how, specs are written, how the whole like communication works, and how the whole structure is. And that way, we kind of like every execution is kind of very similar. And then we can kind of learn and go and improve, as we go along.
How are they similar? In what way?
Just like, the way that we execute, like the way that we communicate inside these squads, the way that we structure work, like plan work, is very, very similar.
So do you have like, for example, like templates that you use for all teams?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for example, like a spec document is one single template, and then the teams use that to, explain the problem and potential solution and whatever. It's the same template.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the same thing is like we have a weekly check-in thread with the squad. Like everybody needs to check in, like what they have worked on, what they will work on, what is blocking them. And it's basically like spread across all squads. So you can easily go into a like squad channel and see like, okay, what is the status of this?
And you use Twist for that.
Yeah, of course.
Twist, for the people who don't know, is their second product, right? Your second product, which is for group working that are for the async group work. I don't know if I butchered your the explanation of the product, but that's my understanding at least.
Yeah, I think you can say that, asynchronous communication, especially like for remote companies or companies that don't want to work real time.
Okay, companies who don't want to work on Slack.
Exactly, yeah, or Microsoft Teams.
I'm not even talking about that. Anyway, if someone from Microsoft is listening, don't listen. But yes, okay, so I want to go one more level down on the quality concept. So you've been working on this problem for 16 years. And you have a very deep understanding of the challenge. And by that problem, I mean like productivity of the people and the teams. So you have a vision and you have a very deep understanding of the challenge and the experience of the users. So sometimes, I don't know if you experienced this, but what I've seen is like if there's a person who's focused on that problem for a long time, sometimes they have a better angle to the problem. So the teams might be missing a certain angle or a certain angle to the solution. Maybe it's not the problem, but the solution might be a bit different. How do you ensure that, your know-how is also transferred to the teams who are actually building it? I mean, how do you manage to transfer that know-how without like micromanaging, for example?
That's a great question. And something to note as well is like we actually hired a head of product very late. So I was actually basically the head of product for a long time. I think we hired Dominic like 1 year and something ago, our head of product, and maybe like as a founder. And I think like it's really critical to have like a really great collaboration and be on the same wavelength as the head of product. So really, I think for me, that is like a critical thing. And that's also like why I waited so long to hire a head of product, because I didn't really think I could find like a person I could be like on the same wavelength and they kind of understand and make like the right calls. So there's like a really deep trust issue there, especially as a product person. Like I love product and I also really want us to be like world class at product. So, having that collaboration with Dominic has been super critical, and having trust, So that's like the founder perspective is like, I really need to have a head of product that I can trust and that I also at a wavelength, and like the decision he's going to make is the decision I will make. And honestly, he makes like decisions sometimes much better than I would make them, which is great. Like that's even better, And then of course, like he kind of, that trickles down to his team, like of PMs. And also for me, like I'm currently here in Istanbul to actually hang around the product team. So, we kind of like jamming on product, talking about product, how we're going to improve stuff, so that's also like how I transfer like some of my knowledge there. So I hope I kind of answered that question.
Yeah. So, I mean, but how, for example, to add one more layer to that, you're all remote, everybody's in a different place, and you have more than one team, product teams that are working on several different challenges at the same time. I'm sure that there's a written layer, text layer in that transfer of knowledge, in the sense that, like, for example, do you review any of the things before they ship out personally? And do you write comments on it, for example?
Yeah, I mean, something to note about Doist is like we are written culture. Like, we write first. We have very few meetings. Very little of the communication is actually verbal. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is like feedback, is critical. And like I provide feedback, but also a lot of other people provide feedback. So if you ship something that isn't very good, it will be known very fast. So it's not like I go in and approve stuff but it's kind of collective, and we want to ship great stuff. It's kind of like in the cool culture, and this has been like that since the beginning. Like the people we have hired care deeply about the product, about the quality, about shipping things we're proud of.
So, like, for example, if something is very obviously bad, I think it's easy and everybody would comment. But if there's perhaps an incrementally better way of doing something, would that be conveyed via text or, those are the opportunities that I'm mostly curious about?
Yeah, I mean, it would be conveyed via text. But also something to note as well is like we also get a lot of feedback from customers as well. So if you ship something that's not, on par, you get a lot of critical feedback, and then you kind of need to assess the situation and iterate more. And then we also do a lot of beta testing. We have actually, I think, 200,000 like beta testers. So like when we actually do beta testing, it's like with 200,000 people, and they are super opinionated, like they are power users, So we get a lot of like, input like from ourselves, but also from the customers. So I think that's kind of the loop that we have.
So you have more beta users than most startups have users.
Yeah, most likely, yeah.
That's pretty interesting. So before we started the recording, you were talking about how you're friends with Aytekin, founder of Jotform, which is a Turkish company that was started in Ankara, and now they have offices a bunch of different cities, who I hosted here as well. And there was one thing that I told you, like there was one question that I wanted to ask, and while I was preparing, I thought of Aytekin. The reason is that I visited him in Ankara one time, and he was very generous enough to show me like the office and how they were working inside. And I actually visited it there. I don't know what it was called, but it was basically like a product review session where Aytekin meets with product teams for, I think, 10 minutes it was at the time. And he reviews their work. And one of the feedbacks that he was giving was like, can you make the package a bit smaller in terms of like, sending to the Android Play Store, so that it's easier to ship, like it's faster to ship, like you can do more iterations for it. Like the comment was so, detailed, like a very small detail, but very critical feedback that made me realize, okay, this is one of the reasons why Jotform is such a good company, because the founder is spending like that much effort in much like that detail. And that's why I was thinking, because in one of your videos on YouTube, you're demoing a product and you know the product so well as the founder. So that made me think, I wonder if you're the same as Aytekin in the sense that you're like very into, like you're very detail oriented in terms of like, product specs and like how they design things and how they ship things and all that. So that was the question that I was thinking about. So like, do you go into that in terms of like working with teams on the solutions and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And also something to note is like I have been friends with Aytekin for like a long time now. I think multiple years. We have a monthly meeting and where we kind of chat about all of stuff. And so I would say like I go to the same detail as him, but it's kind of very different medium. So I don't do like, meetings. I don't do many meetings, but I will like create a thread and like I will let, the Android team know like this is, bad, or like in this needs improvement, I have this issue. Yeah. And I think, you really need to care deeply about, the product you're building, because if you don't, I think it kind of sets a bad example for everybody else. Yeah. And, maybe Jotform is like very successful because he cares deeply, and he goes into the details. So I think definitely like as a founder, like any like product leader, like you need to go and, use the stuff and care deeply about the stuff, and also let people know like when things can be improved. So actually a lot of times, like, I'm a huge user of Doist. Like I've probably used it every day since 2007. So when I spot something, I definitely like provide the feedback to people. But still, like I think my way of like managing and leading is like very different from his. So you have like a lot of like different examples, and maybe it's just like, you need to figure out like what is the way you want to lead the team. So for instance, like I would never go in and like, maybe never is a strong word, but like I will leave the feedback, and then it's really up to them if they want to prioritize it or not. I will not tell them, you need to do this. It's more like, okay, I have this issue, and then they can kind of take this info, stack it against all the other things they are doing. And the reason for this is like, I really think as a founder or CEO, or any leader, like your words count a lot. And then you can kind of derail the whole project if you just go in and like provide random feedback, and then people are kind of like scrambling around and maybe changing some things that maybe should not be changed. Yeah. So that's also something I think about a lot. Is kind of like, still empowering people and making sure that I'm not derailing projects.
How do you maintain that level of care for 13 years? Like, does it ever fluctuate? Or has it always been like, I'm 100% on this problem?
I think this is also like about personality and like what your interests are and what the mission is. So for me, like I figure out very quickly that social networks isn't where my passion is. And I feel like super burned out by working on that. But in this space, I feel like we are empowering people, we're helping them get more stuff done, be less stressed, get more organized. And it's kind of like a, positive thing to the world. So that's kind of the motivator is like, I really feel with that, like connect to that, the work that we're doing. And then it does not really become like a burden. That's one aspect. The other aspect is also like the culture we have built. So given that we are not really VC funded, like we make our own rules, and we are fully free to do whatever we want. So that also means that we can kind of create a culture that we like to work in. And I think this is also like a part of why, I have not really burned out. Like it's not really fluctuating. Like I start a day, I'm super excited about what we're working on. And it's kind of like every day. And I think like if you as a person don't do that, you wake up and you kind of hate your life, you want to change it, then it's a great indicator that you need to change, because if you just continue that, you're going to get burned out. And all of us, like, we have a lot more years to work on. And in long term, it's just like a bad optimization strategy to just like, keep doing stuff that kind of makes you miserable. So I know this because, that was my life when I worked at a social network. I would start every day and, like, honestly, like that was super stressful as well. And I would not sleep well because, the servers were burning, I would get into work and I was just like, fuck, like, I don't want to do this. Like, and that isn't really very sustainable.
Which is a good segue into your the blog that you have in the company. Its name is Ambition and Balance. That was very interesting to me. Why is it called Ambition and Balance?
Yeah, and that's like very connected to this of not burning out. And I think especially ambitious people, you can get into this mode where your only driver is your ambition. And, that can kind of make you make like decisions that are not really good for your well-being. And maybe you can do this for a few years, but long term, you're basically going to burn out. So I think that this balanced aspect is super critical. And especially, like having like a family, having friends, a social life, having like life outside of work, it's super critical, as much as, the work that we do is critical and like you want to do a positive contribution to the world, but I still think, you need to also maintain your well-being. And I feel like especially, in the US-driven culture, this is kind of lost because work is kind of like the only thing they care about. Of course, like this is, I think, getting better, but, still like if you look at Elon Musk, like, he has a lot of kids, but I don't think he sees them a lot of times. Like, yeah. And, I think that this said, as well, something I think that's super critical is, and that is actually something we have like changed. So one of our core values was actually ambition and balance at some point, but we actually removed the balance piece. And the reason why is like people thought that balance meant that it's kind of like, drinking pina coladas on a beach. It's like, or like that you should relax at work, or, it's like work isn't stressful. And I think really the core thing about balance and ambition is kind of like, you need to have the ability to turn it off. So you're going in and you're giving like 110%, like you're, like if you play sports, you go in, give it 100%. Then afterwards you relax and recharge. It does not mean that you go in and work like 50%, or that you go in and you don't really are intense about the work you do. So that's something that I think is very critical. It's like, I think a lot of people, especially, we get a ton of job applicants where I think, oh, like, yeah, finally a company where I don't need to work hard. Or like, and that is not really true, like Doist is a super hard place to work. We set the standard very high, but, we expect you to like give you 100%, but then like recharge afterwards, take vacations. So that's really, I think, the missing piece of this like ambition and balance is kind of like, it's not like balancing on the intensity level. It's more like, turning it off and turning it on.
Okay. So let's say long-term sustained hard work is the goal. You don't want to be like, okay, work 17 hours a day for maybe a couple of years and then burn out, but rather, I don't know, 8 hours, 9 hours. I don't know how many hours you work, but, that many hours a day for years and years and years and years. That's the goal, I'm guessing.
Exactly. And more like tackling this like a sport, you're an athlete, like you're not, and you go in and like, you give it your best and then you recharge. Same, with like, if you look at like super athletes, like they are not playing their sport all the time,
They shouldn't be injured.
Yeah. And same with us, like we need to manage like the injuries, and our injuries are mental, but also body, like if you don't exercise, you are just working all the time, eating bad, you're going to pay the price at some point.
What systems or, how do you ensure that level of, day-to-day, quote-unquote, intensity? I don't know if intensity is the right word, but or urgency or like, the 110% you mentioned, like putting that on every day, like how do you maintain that?
I mean, it's a great question. And I think something we have been bad at is basically like we have not really defined this very well when we did our core values. So this is why we kind of needed to update the core values to kind of like say, okay, this is actually what we mean by balance. So I think like we're kind of like I think we changed our core values maybe 2 years ago, and we're kind of like in this process of like, making sure that people know what we mean and we also enforce these values. But I think it's hard though, and especially hard, in a remote setting, asynchronous setting to do this.
I mean, I'm sure this would change, the answer would change from like company to company, but for a person who wants to emulate what you have built here in terms of like, high intensity during the day, but wanting to do this for a long time, working on a single problem for a long time, what would you recommend? Like, how would you say, like, an entrepreneur who wants to follow this route of building a business, what would be the things to focus on?
Something that's always like caveat with these things is, every person is different, every situation is different. And I think like emulating or like following like a playbook, there isn't really a playbook. So everybody needs to find their own journey. But something that has worked a lot for me, and I think like it's a great starting point regardless of where you are in your life, is basically becoming like a learning machine and always like investing in like, becoming better, learning more, growing as a person. And I think if you do that, and if you do that constantly, so for instance, for me, like I have read and, like follow podcasts, blah, 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 for like ever. Like, and I do that still every day, I try to read something every day or every week. I try to listen to interesting podcasts, read books, and just like, accumulating knowledge, talking to people as well. Like maybe, like for instance, Ayatkin from Jotform is a great example. Like I have learned a lot from him, like a very different perspective of how to tackle like business problems, product problems. So I think it's really like, learning and becoming better and never really be satisfied with the status quo. So I think that's maybe a much better starting point than actually starting, with building a business with a like specific culture or whatever. It's kind of investing in yourself and becoming better.
Were you always a learning machine, or did you become a learning machine?
I became a learning machine.
How did you become?
Yeah, I mean, the thing to note about my history is like, I was a refugee in Denmark and my parents kind of lost everything and we started from scratch. And we actually had like a grocery store, like selling fruits. And I worked in this grocery store and I hated it, And I also I used like my summer vacations while my like Danish friends were like vacationing in like exotic places. I was picking strawberries. And I figured like maybe when I was like, I don't know, 14, like the only way I can make, my life better is like I need to start to use my head. And that's where I actually became like much better student, took education very, very seriously. And also something as well that for me is kind of like, there's a lot of like people that go into education to just get a diploma. Like I went there to actually learn. And then I really didn't care about like the grades. I wanted to learn. And that also like changed a lot, like my perspective. So I would say like after, picking strawberries and figuring out that isn't really what I want to do with my life, that I need to kind of become smarter and use my head instead.
Okay. And then that created the learning machine.
Yeah.
And that compounded up until now.
Yeah.
And it keeps compounding, obviously.
Yeah. And also a lot of times, like something I do a lot of times is kind of like, I get like, for instance, like right now, like we don't really have any sales. So I'm kind of like reading a lot.
Salespeople?
Yeah, we don't have any sales. So I'm just like reading about sales. And like, I see like a podcast about sales. I'm going to listen to that. So a lot of times, like I also like some of my learning is also strategic. Like maybe, it's a skill I need to learn or become better at or like just have an understanding of. And at some point, you kind of begin to practice that or like learn that. And same thing is like with product management as well. It's like, I really didn't know much about it. Like for me, it was just like intuition, but the field is much deeper than that. And there's like so much theory and like, also like how do you hire a head of product? That's also super hard. And what are you going to judge them on? And like, how do you know if head of product is good or not? So there's a lot of stuff. So that's also, I think, like why this work is so interesting. It's kind of like, it's always a new challenge. You always need to learn something new. You always need to grow.
Very cool. One last question. 11 years ago, you joined Startup Chile, and there they asked you a question, your future in one phrase. Do you remember your answer?
Building better things.
building bigger things. Bigger things.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you, has that changed? Like, what's your future in one phrase right now in 2023?
I think it's like that could sum it up.
Building bigger things?
Yeah. And, at some point, like, I think, like, as you grow as a person, maybe initially you just want to be like Raymond profitable, and then you kind of like put the goal higher and higher. And I think like where I'm right now, like I really want to create impact, I really want to create something that's kind of like, a little dent in the universe, like Steve Jobs said, because else, it becomes like boring, and definitely for me, I and Doist as well. It's kind of like we really want to make our own contribution and do something that's kind of super impactful on like global scale.
When you increase the challenge, do you ever like, doubt yourself, or do you ever like, okay, this is a bit much? Like, do you ever get scared or not anymore?
Yeah, I definitely do that. Like, and you also, like something I also question is like, is it really something I want to commit myself to, but also, I don't know. I mean, at some point I was actually I saw this like as a negative trait of myself because I was never really satisfied with the current position that we have. I always want to, be like better, be bigger. And I just think it's like human nature. And I think it's a like lovely feature. And I think we should celebrate that. Of course, like, again, like you should do it like in a balanced pace. Like if it becomes like all consuming and you don't really have a life, you don't have family, you don't have friends, then, it's not probably worth it. But like, having like always challenges and pushing yourself and trying to do better and be better. Yeah, I think that's a lovely aspect.
I think this is a great way to end this amazing conversation. Amir, thank you so much. First of all, for accepting my offer and saying yes to a random offer from Twitter. And thank you so much for taking the time and explaining things in very, in detail and sharing your experience.
Aaron, this has been lovely. Some wonderful questions. And I think, I have been to Turkey many times. I love the country. I love the people as well. So having this has been lovely. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's listening. And we'll be seeing you in the next episode.